Good afternoon. Hopefully you are having a nice time in class without me and you're thinking about me and how I got my tonsils taken out and you're feeling sorry for me. What you're going to learn about today are the properties of water, the water cycle, and some unintended consequences of human interference with the water cycle. So last time you saw a little bit about biogeochemical cycles and why we need energy and matter in both of them, and about water budgets. Today we're going to talk about properties of water that make it essential for life, and we're really going to focus on this life part. I could talk about the properties of water without mentioning a living thing one time, but this is biology, and biology is the study of living things, so we're really going to focus on how this is affecting living organisms. One thing that's important about water is that it's the universal solvent. That means that it dissolves more substances on Earth than any other liquid. It dissolves gases. It dissolves solids. And we know from our previous studies about the circulatory system that this means gases, nutrients, anything that an organism needs to transport, it can transport by the means of its circulatory system. So any sort of multicellular organism has some type of circulatory system. It could be like what we have, where we have a heart and blood vessels. Other organisms have different types of circulatory systems, but organisms all have one. There is some method for transporting materials from one cell to the next. Now, why does water dissolve things? Well, the reason is the fact that it is a polar molecule. So what does it mean to be polar? If we take a water molecule, like the one that's illustrated on the left, the little blue circles are hydrogens, and the red thing in the middle is the oxygen. And the idea is that the oxygen pulls harder on electrons. The result of this is that the side where oxygen is a little bit negative. And the side where hydrogen is a little bit positive. And so you're going to ask me, what is that weird S-looking thing that you drew? This is the Greek letter delta. Then you're going to say, no. I took physics and I know that this is the Greek letter delta. And I'm here to tell you that both are correct. The triangle is capital delta. The funny S is lowercase delta. So it's two uses for the same Greek letter. In this case, it means partially, slightly. So I like to think it looks like an S, and it means slightly negative or slightly positive. If you want to write it, make an S, and then just keep going on the bottom a little bit. Now, this idea of partial positive and partial negative is really a chemistry topic. If you took Chem 20 or you're going to take Chem 20, you'll do a whole unit where you talk about this. What I'm interested in you knowing is that one side of water is positive, the other is negative. The result, water forms pretty strong things called hydrogen bonds. If you look at the picture, that is an oxygen, and this is a hydrogen. What we're saying is that a hydrogen from one water will be attracted to an oxygen from another, because hydrogen side is positive and oxygen side is negative. Now, water is not the only molecule that has this polar characteristic. Any other molecule that is also polar will react to water like this. And that's how water can pull apart, can dissolve substances, by positive parts being attracted to one side of water and negative parts being attracted to the other. And just to remind you, positive is attracted to negative. So opposite charges are attracted to each other. So the second property of water that makes it essential to living organisms is its heat capacity. You would have learned about this in grade 10, probably at some length. It holds heat very well. It takes a long time to heat up and a long time to cool down. So water acts as an insulator from both extremes, from cold and from hot. So you probably learned in grade 10 things that have more to do with the weather. And that's really what my picture on the left is representing. Water can help bring heat around the globe. Water flows, Water can bring heat energy that was absorbed at the equator to more polar regions, thus moderating the temperature. Hot places aren't so hot because water stores some of that heat. Cold places aren't so cold because water releases some heat out into the environment. Now, that's an indirect link to living organisms. If I have more heat around the globe, then I'm permitting photosynthesis, in other words, life to exist. I can't have a food chain if I don't have a producer. The other one is a little more specific to an individual organism. We're talking about internal temperature. So we've mentioned this a number of times, but thermoregulation is possible because your blood is made up of water, and water is a good insulator. Now, the third property of water is that it is cohesive. Again, something you might remember learning in Science 10. Water molecules stick together very well. So they stick to each other. And this is because of intermolecular bonding forces, those hydrogen bonds that we saw. There are also two other kinds of forces. I'm mentioning their names because there's always at least a person or two who has done their chem already. There's probably more than a person or two. This is second semester. And so this might remind you of something that you learned. I am not expecting in this course that you can explain all of these forces to me. I'm just giving you a reference point in case you've taken the course. The idea is that things like hydrogen bonds, where one molecule is attracted to another, happen between water molecules. Because water molecules stick together so well, some organisms can float on the top of the water, like a water strider. That's this insect here. You might have also heard of something called the Jesus lizard. I can't show you a YouTube video and then record it and post it on my own YouTube page, but I can tell you, look it up. Look up a video of the Jesus lizard. The lizard is running really fast, and because the surface tension of the water, so the fact that the water is sticking together so well, is so high, the lizard appears as though it's walking on water. It's quite a cool thing. The other thing, so this would be animal examples. Other examples might have to do with plants. We know that water is moving in a continuous stream through a plant. It moves up through the roots, through the xylem, up to the leaf where it's either used for photosynthesis or where it evaporates via transpiration. But water is always pulled in a continuous stream up the xylem in plants because of this cohesive property. So that means plants have a continual supply of water for photosynthesis, which we know is the beginning of most food chains on the planet. Now, cohesive and the next one usually get talked about at the same time. Water is also adhesive. Water molecules stick to other substances, again, due to things like hydrogen bonding. So water can have these attractive forces between itself and another water molecule, or between itself and a different molecule. As long as they're both polar, they can have this force. This means water can act as a lubricant. And what it does in a lot of animal organisms is it protects joints. Any joint surface, anywhere there are movable parts, whether you're a vertebrate and you have bones or you're an invertebrate and you do not, if you have movable parts, something is going to rub against something. Two pieces of tissue are going to rub against each other. The same would be true, for example, between organs. So we already saw that there are tissues in place to protect your lungs and your heart from rubbing against each other, and that there's fluid involved. For example, the pleural membranes around your lungs have water in between them so that things are not sticking together and so that there's less friction. So down here is an example of some joints. So we're just highlighting your shoulder is a joint, your elbow, your wrist, your hip, your ankle, your knee. Those are all joints, and there is fluid in all of those places to help protect your bones from friction. The other thing has to do with plants, and here's the idea. Water doesn't just stick to itself, it sticks to xylem. Xylem is the name of the tissue that is in the stem of the plant. It's the vascular tissue of the plant. If we wanted to make an analogy, it's like the blood vessel of the plant. And water sticks to those cells so that it doesn't fall back down to the ground. It continues to move upward toward the leaf to allow photosynthesis. Now, last property of water is its density. This is an anomalous property, and anomalous means unusual, different, not the normal. When water freezes, its density decreases. And that's not normal. For most other substances, if I took the solid and froze it, or if I took the liquid and froze it, the solid is actually more dense than the liquid. So the key idea is that ice floats. So why is that a big deal? Well, reason one is that as ice melts, water cycles down and ice floats. So we're getting this continual movement of water up and down. So I have ice at the top. It will melt, turn into water. The water will freeze, turn into ice. So that's helping the matter move around, helping it acquire energy, helping it acquire nutrients. So in particular, this helps nutrients and oxygen circulate through aquatic ecosystems. So here I'm talking about any type of fish that might want to live in the water, or any sort of organism that lives in the water will depend on this cycling of nutrients. Otherwise, once all the oxygen at the bottom is used up, that's it. More isn't going to come. So we need this continual movement of water, and temperature change helps water cycle. The colder it gets and it freezes, it starts floating to the top. The other idea is that ice insulates the environment during the winter. So if I take this lake that's here, I have my lake and I have some ice on top. My fish are still super happy living in the water that is under the ice. And that's because there's still water under the ice. Once ice forms at the top and it covers the entire surface, it's protecting the water underneath from coming in contact with the environment, maintaining its temperature warm enough so that it can stay liquid. If I had ice that didn't float, here's what would happen. Some ice would form, and then it would sink to the bottom, and I would have ice at the bottom. And then more ice would form, and it would sink. And then more ice would form and sink. And eventually, my entire lake would be full of ice. Running water could not be underneath the ice because the ice is not floating. And I would have some dead fish and other organisms in that body of water. So it is important for life so that they can get nutrients cycled and so that they can survive when water freezes. Now this next slide is the water cycle, and I just want to remind you of a few words that you're probably familiar with. For example, the idea that evaporation is when water changes from a liquid to a gas. That condensation is when water changes from a gas to a liquid. That precipitation does not have to only mean rain. It can mean rain, snow, hail, sleet. Anything that is falling from the sky, basically, counts as precipitation. Transpiration you would have learned about in Science 10. It happens specifically in plants, and it's mimicking evaporation. It is when a liquid turns into a gas. Runoff is water that is on the surface. The idea of a river. So you'll see on the picture, surface runoff is what's coming here between this lake that's by the mountains and it's running down towards the ocean. The key idea, surface. Percolation, which we can also call leaching, is the movement of surface water to an aquifer. And you're going to say, what's an aquifer? So if you take a look at the picture, here is an aquifer. Aquifer is a place where you find groundwater. So groundwater is underground, and the aquifer is a collection area. a space where water collects into, say, an underground river or an underground lake. The water table has to do with the level of groundwater. So how much water is under the ground, how high is it coming up? We generally have a pretty high water table in this neck of the woods, especially in the spring, because as you're well aware, we have this flood risk all the time, and that's putting a lot of water into the soil. The last thing that we'll talk about is some unintended consequences of human interference, the idea of acid rain. Acid rain is just one way that humans can interfere with the water cycle. We do a ton of things that mess up water. Acid rain is just one of them. Now, you'll see that I'm saying it's coming from SOx and NOx. You might say, what is that? SOx. Well, the X represents a number that can change. S represents sulfur, O represents oxygen. So if you remember your naming rules from Science 10, sulfur oxide. I don't know how many oxygens there are, so I'm not going to say mono or di or tri. And that's what we're getting at, is that there's several combinations of sulfur and oxygen. If we have sulfur oxides, or the other compound then would be nitrogen oxides, those compounds can be the root of the acid rain. Now, what is acid rain? You might say, oh, it's any rain that has a pH less than 7. And that's probably not how we would describe it. We usually say it's got to be less than 5 or somewhere between 4 and 5, depending on who you ask. I did a Google search the other day, and I found 3 different websites. One that said anything less than 5.6, another that said 4.5, and another that said 4.8. There were numbers all over the place. What I want you to understand is that normal rain is acidic, but only slightly. That means its pH is less than 7, but not by a lot. Hey, maybe by just a tiny bit. On the pH scale, each number is based on a power of 10. So if a neutral substance has a pH of 7, something that has a pH of 5 is 2 steps down. 7, 6, 5. So that means 2 powers of 10. So something that has a pH less than 5 is 100 times more acidic than something that has a pH of 7. That's a big deal. Normal rain has a pH that's a little bit less than 7, in the 6s usually somewhere, but that's not nearly as much as 100 times. What are the steps? My gas, so for example, my nitrogen oxide, mixes with water that is usually in a cloud somewhere to produce acid. That is the short, brief version. So if you take a look at my picture down here, here's my factory. What we're doing is we are burning things, generally, and that's how we're producing those gases. The gases come up here, mix with water that's in the atmosphere, and then my acid rain falls. So what kind of damage can happen? Well, I can damage living, but also non-living organisms. For my living organisms, I've made a few points down here. I could have bioamplification or biomagnification. And the way I get bioamplification is usually actually a result to non-living organism damage. So I'll explain both of them. I could damage living tissue. That's pretty obvious. I could damage the plants that are absorbing water, doing photosynthesis, or even plants that are in the spot where the acidic rain is falling. It could damage the inside or the outside. Now, it could also damage my living tissue indirectly. And the way it could do that would be by altering the conditions of the environment, making another nutrient less available. So perhaps if the water is acidic, now less oxygen content is available. So it doesn't have to be direct damage, it could be indirect. The acidic conditions affect another nutrient, and now that nutrient is not as available. The bioamplification effect is also a little bit indirect. I will let you know that acidic water can start to dissolve metal pipes. And I'm going to use lead, Pb, as my example. If acidic water runs through a lead pipe, now lead is in the water. Once this metal is in the water, it can move up the food chain. Another big one is mercury. Mercury is a heavy metal that's found in water that often affects aquatic food chains. But anything that's in the water could realistically now become part of the food chain if the producer absorbs it. Now, how can we reduce damage? Obviously, there's the whole pollute less idea. But there are ways that we can try to get rid of the acid rain after it has fallen. And one of those examples is a procedure called liming. There is something called limestone. It's a rock. And liming adds a base. So the idea is that you take a bunch of these rocks that occur naturally. There's nothing wrong with these rocks. A lot of lakes in Alberta actually have these as their base, which is why we have maybe less of a problem than places on the east coast. But we add this rock to the bottom of the lake, and it naturally neutralizes the acid that is there. It's not a perfect fix, but it's a method that can be used after the fact. So we have don't make as much acid, or if we do, that's a way that we can try to get rid of it. That is all for the video today. I will talk to you again tomorrow.